So conclusively, we've shown and we see that in people with salt intakes that are similar to what the current people in the US consume, not to mention what Huberman recommends, which is actually in some ways slightly more, the higher end of the range is slightly more, they see a substantially reduced risk of death, suggesting that if you take Huberman's recommendations of salt intake and you replace some of that with potassium rather than sodium, you're going to see health benefit. Suggesting if you follow Huberman's recommendations, as opposed to reducing salt, or if you even increase them, you're increasing your risk of death, according to all the best known randomized controlled trial, causal level, gold standard, highest quality literature that Huberman neglects to mention in his podcast. And with that, we're done with this particular part. In the next episode, we will be going and cutting into the minutia of these particular studies and how they are conducted and why they're different from the observational literature and why the observational literature is wrong and these studies are right. Greetings, this is Kevin Bass at the dietwars.com, also the Kevin Bass Show, as you are now watching or listening to, depending upon the medium by which you are consuming this information. I'm going to continue on from part 3 of the debunking of the Huberman episode number 63, the one directed about salt, where he shares a great deal of what can only be characterized as misinformation about salt recommendations, salt requirements, and salt science. And I'm going to be systematically tearing that apart, ripping it down, demolishing it, and essentially scientifically dissecting it in this third part and in all subsequent parts of the serialized debunking of that particular podcast episode. To do that, I discussed an agenda, sort of a table of contents, as it were, in my last episode, part 2 of this series. But I forgot when writing that and when presenting that information to part 2, I forgot that during this time was actually released on Red Pen Reviews a new review of James DiNicolantonio's book, The Salt Fix. Now, The Salt Fix, as is mentioned, is written by James DiNicolantonio and is lauded, heavily cited, and recommended by Huberman at several different points in the podcast that Huberman gives. In fact, Huberman cites it as one of the main sources that he uses and that he recommends other people use to get good information about salt and salt requirements for their health. And in the process of writing these series of episodes, as I mentioned, Red Pen Reviews released a review of The Salt Fix written by Hilary Bethencourt. Red Pen Reviews is itself organized by Stephan Guyenet, who debated Gary Taubes on the Joe Rogan Experience. I advocated for Stephan to be the person to debate Gary because I certainly wasn't ready to do that at that time. I was certainly advocating for more balance on Joe's show, and Joe did, to his credit at that time, oblige, and he had Gary and Stephan on. And so Stephan created this website in the aftermath of that, actually in the aftermath of another website. I forget what it's called. It's part of Nutrition Cast, but there's a Seth Yoder. In any case, he made another website where he would systematically debunk different and review different books and the claims made in those different books in order to help people understand how those books are good or bad or trustworthy or not. And so in that vein, Stephan created this one website called Red Pen Reviews, where he just systematically reviews these books, and he has people working for him that do so. In this case, Hilary Bethencourt wrote this review of The Salt Fix. And again, James DiNicolantonio, heavily recommended by Huberman. Also, interestingly, is a close colleague of Joseph Mercola, who was threatened with legal action by the Biden administration, singled out as one of the biggest pushers of COVID misinformation, and threatened And Merkel ended up deleting all of his online content in order to avoid serious legal penalties for the harm that it was causing. James DiNicolantonio is a co-author of a book with this man, but that's I think that reflects on James's credibility. However, that doesn't necessarily directly address the scientific claims. And in this review, we are going to see how the scientific claims stack up to the science. Now, this website is impartial. It's nonpartisan. Stefan is somebody who has his own set of views about things that are very nuanced, detailed, and independent. And so when he writes things and when he carefully documents them in the way that he has or he has done for this website, people listen as they should. For example, as we can see this greatly extended point-by-point debunking with extensive references of various different points in the salt fix. And the interesting thing about Stefan's review of the salt fix, again, this is the book that Huberman recommends, and he draws much of his own inspiration and content and recommendations from and science from. This book got a 20% score for scientific accuracy out of 100%. So you have salt fix at 20%, ultimate volumetric diet with 80%, carnivore code with 28%, and that's a pretty grim book there. As far as scientific accuracy is concerned, Eat, Drink, and Be Healthy, the Harvard Medical School Guide to Healthy Eating with 95%, Eat Fat, Get Thin, 30%, End of Alzheimer's, 42%, Eat Right for Your Blood Type, Eat Right for Your Type, 30%. So the blood type diet has a better score than the salt fix in terms of scientific accuracy. In fact, I looked at all the different diet books I could find, and many of them are very, very poorly regarded in the scientific community. And the only other book with as low of a scientific accuracy rating is Grain Brain, which posits that eating grains essentially destroys the brain. It causes, it's harmful to the brain. It causes Alzheimer's disease, ADHD, mental illnesses, depression, headaches, etc. The only other book that has as low as scientific accuracy is David Perlmutter's The Grain Brain, which has a 20% scientific accuracy score, and which posits that grains are destroying your brain. Eating wheat, eating bread destroys your brain. Okay, so it's not very well regarded automatically. The overall score is about 40%. Now again, that's comparable to the lowest of the low in terms of the overall score. In fact, Grain Brain beats it out. The only one that gets a lower score is the carnivore code, which tells people they should only eat meat. That's all you should ever eat, is just eat meat, is the carnivore code. Plants are toxic. So it gets 2% higher overall score than the carnivore code says plants are toxic, you should only eat meat. Let's look at a little bit of this. I have the power is actually going off on the computer in 15 minutes, so I'm only going to get through this segment of this part, but I'm going to try to get through it relatively quickly because I don't want to interrupt it whenever I switch over to my other set of recording equipment, because that would be I don't want to break up the momentum. So let's see here. Scientific accuracy, 20%, overall score, 40%. Okay, fine. Key points from our review. The book scored poorly in scientific accuracy because it makes overly confident claims based on weak studies. If that rings a bell to you guys here, that's why, because it's making overly confident claims based on basically observational literature, while ignoring stronger evidence and arguments that aren't consistent with its message. So it ignores stronger evidence and other arguments that are not consistent with its message and cherry picks the weaker evidence to make a story that's essentially unscientific. And it says, overall, the scientific evidence suggests that typical intakes of salt contribute to high blood pressure and probably cardiovascular disease. And limiting salt intake is probably healthy for most people. I think that's an understatement. I think the evidence at this point is conclusive that limiting salt intake, reducing salt intake is going to reduce high blood pressure and reduce cardiovascular disease. in my opinion, or it's as conclusive as we would get. And if it ends up not being the case, I think all of us would be incredibly surprised, to the point that I think we can, like, with strong degree of confidence, say that is the case. Now, probably is a broad term. Does it mean 95%? Does it mean 60% certainty? Does it mean 99% certainty? I think the certainty is closer to 99%. And maybe Stefan would agree with me there. I believe he probably would. It's closer to 99% than it is closer to 60%. It's almost certain that reducing sodium intake reduces cardiovascular disease risk. And as the review continues to point out, the references in the book usually only offer weak support to its strong claims. The book's advice to limit added sugars and refined grains and increase intakes of whole foods is helpful. So it does give credit where credit is due. Yeah, reduce added sugars, reduce fine grains, increase intake of whole foods. It's not a bad idea. So weak support, strong claims. Let's see if we can pull out a few of the most pertinent points. So what Stefan and colleagues did, Hilary Bethencourt in particular, as she conducted this review, she reviewed three main claims in the salt fix. High salt diets do not cause hypertension or heart disease. Low salt diets are detrimental to cardiovascular and metabolic health. That is to say, keeping salt within the recommended ranges. Increasing salt above the recommended thresholds will improve health, reduce sugar cravings, and support efforts to lose weight. For scientific accuracy, the salt fix received an overall score. I guess they also scored on a scale of 1 to 10, of 1.3, or is it a scale of 1 to 5? Not sure. That's interesting. They have two different scales. Interesting. Two different scales. In any case, the claims we reviewed received low scores on scientific accuracy. The broader literature that we reviewed revealed a vigorous ongoing debate about the first two claims, and there appears to be limited and inconsistent evidence related to the third claim. Salt fix relies heavily on speculation, short-term experiments, and observational studies that have been criticized by other experts in the field for their methodological flaws. Again, speculation, short-term studies, and observational studies, right? It's not looking at randomized controlled trials. It's not looking at long-term studies, okay? So let's look at some of the scoring for the scientific accuracy part. So the book contains claims like this: if salt caused heart disease, chest pain leading to sudden death, and Europeans were consuming 40 grams of salt in the 1500s, there should have been hundreds of thousands of reports of heart disease during this time. I hope they debunk this. I don't know if they directly debunk this. Okay, so then I'll take a stab. Look, 40 grams of salt per day. We don't know that they consume 40 grams of salt per day in the 1500s. Okay, and the other part of this is that heart disease is multifactorial, so they might have been consuming 40 grams of salt in 1500s. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have cardiovascular disease, right? Doesn't mean they're going to cause heart disease. And also in the 1500s, they might have just been dying before they got heart disease. But this misunderstands and misrepresents the whole idea of causality for cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is a multi-causal disease, so not one thing's going to cause it. So some people with extremely high salt intakes, extremely high blood pressure, extremely high LDL cholesterol, and other risk factors that are also very bad will never get heart disease, right? Because of the variance in heart disease, we only have captured about 25% of that in our known risk factors. And salt intake and hypertension is only a part of that 25% of that variance. right? So simply increasing salt is not necessarily going to cause cardiovascular disease, but it contributes to the risk in what is called a multifactorial disease. So you can automatically see just with this first quote, and this is the reason why I was taking a stab at debunking this first quote, you can already see with this first quote, the form of argumentation is at a very low level. Okay, that's all I wanted to demonstrate with that. It's like, that's not, one does not follow from the other. It doesn't follow that because they're consuming 40 grams, there necessarily should have been a lot of heart attacks. It doesn't follow that because there weren't a lot of heart attacks, therefore salt doesn't cause heart disease. It doesn't follow, right? There's so many reasons why that doesn't follow. In any case, how well is the claim supported by scientific evidence that high salt diets do not cause blood pressure or heart disease? It received a score of 1 out of 4. A large body of literature on this topic suggests that this claim is incorrect. Summaries of animal experiments, observational studies, migration studies, population-based studies, and randomized controlled trials paint a compelling picture of high salt consumption contributing to high blood pressure. Okay. And we're not going to read the rest because we don't have time to just go through the whole review. It would take several hours to do so. But let's look at this. Are there references cited in the book to support the claim convincing? 1 out of 4, right? Okay, it's a 1 out of 4. How well does the strength of the claim line up with the strength of the evidence? A 1 out of 4, right? So claim 2. So claim 1 gets a 1 out of 4 for everything, right? Nothing lines up. Nothing is supported. This idea that salt doesn't that salt does not cause heart disease or hypertension. Like, it's overwhelming evidence, like, in the other direction. Okay. So claim 2: low salt diets are detrimental to cardiovascular disease and metabolic health. Okay, let's look at the different scorings here. 1 out of 4 for how well is the claim supported by the evidence. 1 out of 4 for the references cited in the book to support the claim convincing. 1 out of 4, how well does the strength of the claim line up with the strength of the evidence? Okay, so 1 out of 4 for claim 2. Claim 3: increasing salt intake above the recommended thresholds will help reduce sugar cravings and support the efforts to lose weight. So for 1 out of 4 for claim supported by the evidence, 0 out of 4 for how well the strength of the claim lines up with the strength of the evidence. I didn't know you could get a 0. You can get a 0. The overall score for, and then another 0 out of 4 for how, okay, 0 out of 4 for the last two criteria, right? So it's a 0.3 out of 4 for the overall score for claim 3, and then for score for scientific accuracy is a 0.8 out of 4, which I guess constitutes the 20% scientific accuracy, because 0.8 out of 4 is 20%. We've now understood the the way that that's done and why the scoring systems seem different. In fact, they were not. So this is the book, and you guys can read this review on Stefan's website, redpinreviews.org, where you can evaluate whether you think this is a compelling review about the book, but it's the most comprehensive review of the book around. And yet this is the book that's promoted by Huberman. I tweeted at Huberman pointing this out. Hey, there's this book. You need to be careful about this in your podcast. And in fact, I can pull that tweet up in a moment. But I tweeted at him. He didn't respond, right? He didn't respond. Okay. All right. So that's that. And now let's get to Taubes. And I mentioned that Taubes is not a credible source for this in the first place in my one of my beginning debunkings of Huberman, as I've referenced earlier in this podcast episode. But in this podcast, I want to use this article, which addresses Taubes' claims, in order to provide a bridge to part 4. Okay? So, but to recap what we've gotten, we've seen very clearly that James De Nicole Antonio is not a credible reference. He's in fact a terrible reference. He's a terrible source of information. Yet he's being promoted by Huberman to support his salt intake recommendations, and also, as I pointed out, to promote Element. But now we have this Harvard website. It's called the Nutrition Source, and you can see the URL at the top. I'll try to include that in the description of the video. It says, it's time for the salt feud to fade. One of the longest running feuds in modern nutrition revolves around a simple question: will reducing salt intake save lives? And I'm going to read most of this particular review to you guys in order to get across this message, because it's written very succinctly and very forcefully. So it's a very good review. It says, for 50 years ago, when the science of salt was just beginning to develop, the controversy was understandable, appropriate, and even helpful. It forced researchers on both sides to scrutinize and improve their work and research methods. A provocative, controversial article in Science magazine by journalist Gary Taubes, this is the article that Huberman cites in previous podcast episodes in which I lambasted him for citing, called The Political Science of Salt, lays out both positions, although Taubes blatantly sided with the camp backing the idea that reducing salt would have little effect on health. And it goes on to talk about some conflicts of interest. It's not really important because we're interested in the science, so we're going to talk about the science right now. The salt doesn't matter much idea was based on several arguments. One was that there are flaws in the studies linking sodium consumption to increased blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. Another was that sodium doesn't exist in isolation, and that other changes that occur when you cut back on sodium, like eating more fruits and vegetables, and thus get more potassium, fiber, and phytochemicals, were in fact those were responsible for the reduction in blood pressure, not the less sodium. At the time, there were no long-term randomized controlled trials testing the effects of salt reduction on health outcomes such as stroke or heart attack or stomach cancer. However, the body of research accumulated over the last 2 decades has answered all but the most recalcitrant critics. The landmark DASH sodium study, a randomized controlled trial, demonstrated the benefits of the low sodium diet. A later trial conducted among 20,000 elderly Taiwanese men showed that lowering dietary sodium and increasing potassium led to a 41% decrease in cardiovascular deaths. The 10-year follow-up of participants in the trials of hypertension prevention demonstrated a 30% reduction in heart attack, stroke, and other cardiovascular events among those in the lower sodium group. And in the next part of this part, so I actually have to change the recording equipment, and so I'm going to pop up on the screen looking completely different because I have to actually just change my setup because the computer's about to die. The next part we will be briefly covering these trials and how conclusive and how compelling they are, and that will be ending this part of this podcast series before we jump in to the next part and really dive into the details of these studies. For this part, we're just going to be giving an overview, and that's that. I'm going to go now. Okay, so I think we've gotten things going again. In this, I look so much better than I normally do. I've got some good lighting going on. In this article, as I pointed out before we had to switch, it points out that Taubes' position was reasonable when he was writing at the time. But over the last couple decades, it's no longer a reasonable position. And that's because randomized controlled trial evidence has disproven it. Randomized controlled trial is the gold standard for evidence. It's the kind of evidence that you need to conclusively show something that's true, assuming the randomized controlled trials are designed in the right way. It conclusively shows that an intervention has an effect, a desired effect. And in these particular trials, what you do is you take a group of people, and then you say, okay, you're going to go on placebo, basically a fake treatment, a sugar pill. You're going to be told you're taking in the treatment, but you're not actually taking the treatment, because this rules out some sort of placebo effects or expectation bias. It rules out you changing your behavior based on thinking that you have the treatment. So if you have a treatment group that is given a placebo, then they're going to change the behavior. They're going to do all the different things the same way as the treatment group that's actually given the treatment. And all of those new things, those new behaviors, those new expectations are not going to, since both groups are receiving them, the group receiving the treatment and the group receiving the placebo, both groups are receiving placebo essentially because both groups believe they're having the treatment. So therefore, both groups are going to be changing the behavior accordingly. Then you can really isolate what the actual effect of the real treatment is, because that's given on top of this expectation. So both groups are given a treatment. One is active, one is the actual real treatment, and one is a fake treatment that doesn't have any activity. Okay? To isolate and figure out what the real effect of the real treatment is, and to isolate on clinical outcomes what the real effect of treatment is. So that is the idea of a randomized controlled trial, and we've done many of these in the past 3 decades. And this Harvard article points out that fact and points out that as a result, we can conclusively know that salt restriction is a good idea for cardiovascular disease. Which is why, in that Red Pin Reviews article, it lambasted the idea that we should be eating more salt. It lambasted the salt fix. It said the scientific, on many points, you got a 0 out of 4 for scientific accuracy. This is why, because this is the current evidence base, and people are trying to argue with the current evidence base, which almost is tantamount to arguing that the earth is flat. Okay? I hope that makes sense. So let's look at some of these studies, though. The first one is called DASH. It's a famous study. It's called the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. And the full article name is The Effect on Blood Pressure of Reduced Dietary Sodium and the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension DASH Diet, DASH Sodium Collaborative Research Group. And all they did is they took 412 people. They assigned them to 2 different diets, control diet or DASH diet. And then they did a crossover trial where each participant in each group ate 3 different sodium levels, high, intermediate, and low. And for high, as I'll show you in a moment, for high, at the baseline, it's not here. Yes. For high at the baseline, they had about 3.3 grams per day in the DASH diet group and 3.3 grams per day in the control group. And what does that mean? Well, that means that they're consuming about the average of what Americans consume today, which is about 3.5 grams, right? Okay. And whenever they decrease that to the intermediate sodium group of 2.5 grams or the low sodium group of 1.5 grams, they're decreasing it by a gram or a little bit less than a gram, and then about 1.5 grams or about half to get to the low sodium level. And this is important because we'll see just in a moment looking at this graph. And here is what the graph looks like when you do that. The control diet is the line at the top, DASH diet's the line at the bottom, and then the 3 different sodium intakes are horizontal. So if you take the DASH diet, you're going to get a big drop in blood pressure from just being on the DASH diet versus control diet, about 5.9 millimeters mercury systolic blood pressure, which is substantial, especially over the course of a lifetime. That could really translate into health benefits. But then going from a high sodium intake on the DASH diet to a intermediate sodium intake, so going from the average, essentially the average, right? The average sodium intake of Americans down to the recommendation, the maximum recommendation. That's essentially what's happening. Because we just looked at the different sodium intakes of the different groups. We're going from the current average to the recommendations. You lose another 1.3 millimeters mercury systolic. And again, if you maintain that over the course of a lifetime, that's a big deal. And then whenever you take it down to below, to the ideal, actually, yes, the low level of sodium intake is actually the ideal intake according to the dietary guidelines, currently existing dietary guidelines. You remove another 1.7 millimeters mercury off the DASH diet. Now, you take 1.3 plus 1.7, that's 3 millimeters mercury over the course of the day, every day, and that adds up over time to health outcomes. That's going to significantly affect the shear stress and the pressure in your blood vessels, right? And the diastolic blood pressure is reduced in a similar manner by about 1.6 millimeters mercury. Okay? It's quite interesting. Now, it's most important to note that the biggest effects of going from intermediate to low sodium intake versus just going to intermediate intake are seen with in African Americans with hypertension, okay, and in women. So the bigger reductions in sodium intake will be seen in African Americans with hypertension and in women, and not in men, and not in non-African Americans with hypertension. So essentially in underprivileged groups, right? So the guidelines serve the underprivileged groups the most in terms of the blood pressure reduction of going to low intake compared to an intermediate intake. So meeting the dietary guidelines versus hitting the ideal, which according to the dietary guidelines, I think I've talked about this in the last part, it's going to be 1.5 grams per day sodium. Okay, not salt, sodium. 1.5 grams of salt. Of sodium per day, of sodium. Okay, that is interesting. But what about the effect on mortality? So death, what about the effect of death? Long-term effect on death. A 31-month study in Taiwan. What they did is they had a potassium-enriched salt, so they switched out some of the sodium for potassium, which is what I recommend in another video. You can check out my video on this topic. I think it's mentioned as a health hack in that video. It's an older video done a couple months ago. It's on this topic specifically of changing potassium for sodium in your salt solution and having a potassium-enriched salt solution, which actually tastes better than having a completely sodium chloride salt solution. But very interestingly, in this study, and it's right here, you see a robust reduction in all-cause death in the treatment group versus the control group. So the experimental group is the dashed line. And at about a year, a little bit more than a year, about a year and a third, these two lines start diverging so that the control group is dying at a much, substantially larger rate, about 5% extra, right? 35% versus about 30% risk of death by the end of the study at about 31 months. Okay, so substantially increased risk of death, and more importantly, a substantially increased risk of cardiovascular disease, almost a doubling of not having the potassium-enriched salt compared to the potassium-enriched salt. So this is a good idea in this population, who were people, basically elderly people, average age about 70. But, and this is what's important, you average that effect over a much longer period of time. You say you start in your 30s, or your 40s, or your 20s. If you're a 20-year-old listener in your 20s, you start swapping potassium for salt early on, and those effects are cumulative and will have long-term health benefits, as we shall see in this study, which looked at the effects of sodium restriction on blood pressure. Originally, it was just on blood pressure over the course of a few years, 18 months. 18 months or of 36 to 48 months. So either a year and a half or up to 4 years of reducing sodium intake. And they confirmed in these long-term clinical trials that reducing sodium intake did indeed have an effect on blood pressure. All right. Now, here's where things get most interesting indeed. Then they followed up these patients 10 to 15 years later and looked at the risk of death. Were more of them dying? or less of them if they were in their intervention group. And of the people who are given the sodium restriction intervention group, they had a much lower risk of cardiovascular disease at follow-up. Okay? Isn't that interesting? A much lower risk of cardiovascular disease at follow-up, and a much lower risk of cumulative mortality. About 1% lower risk in mortality. Okay? So, it works, not just for blood pressure, but over the longer term, it works to reduce risk of cardiovascular disease and mortality. What about a study published last year? Oh, by the way, these are all intakes. Let's look at the baseline intake here. I want to show you guys this. If we have it. Yes, baseline intake is 155 millimole, which is very similar. It's very close to 3.5 grams per day. Okay? So it's very close to the current average among Americans. And reducing it from the current average, guess what? Reduced mortality. Okay? And these are in adults aged 30 to 54. Just normal adults with pre-hypertension. Okay? And they all benefited from it. All right? Now, here's a cluster randomized controlled trial of 600 villages in China. 21,000 participants. Over the course of just a few years. We can just look at the graphical abstract for this one. The risk of stroke went down. The risk of death from many causes went down statistically. 12% reduced death from many causes. No increased risk of hyperkalemia from replacing sodium chloride, 25% of sodium chloride with potassium chloride. So conclusively, we've shown and we see that in people with salt intakes that are similar to what the current people in the US consume, not to mention what Huberman recommends, which is actually in some ways slightly more, the higher end of the range is slightly more, they see a substantially reduced risk of death. Suggesting that if you take Huberman's recommendations of salt intake and you replace some of that with potassium rather than sodium, you're going to see health benefit. Suggesting if you follow Huberman's recommendations as opposed to reducing salt, or if you even increase them, you're increasing your risk of death. According to all the best known randomized controlled trial, causal level, gold standard, highest quality literature that Huberman neglects to mention in his podcast. And with that, we're done with this particular part. In the next episode, we will be going and cutting into the minutia of these particular studies and how they are conducted and why they're different from the observational literature and why the observational literature is wrong and these studies are right. And in the course of doing so, we will understand the difference between observational literature and the randomized controlled trial literature in general. This will essentially collapse parts 3 and 4 that were planned into a single part. So I guess it's all going to be part 4. And and then we're going to explain all of the obesity, heart rate, blood pressure, sodium, etc. health paradoxes that I alluded to in part 2 and talked about at great length in part 2. We're going to explain them all given this framework that we've built up in this coming part 4. And then we're going to do the rest of the work, which we talked about in part 2. We're going to do the rest of the work moving on in part 5, part 6, part 7. I hope you guys have enjoyed this podcast. I hope you guys have enjoyed this part. And if you have, check me out on Patreon, first and foremost, at Kevin and Bass, KVINNBASS, 2 N's, in order to make a donation. That would be much appreciated. You could also check me out at Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, at Kevin and Bass, KVINNBASS also, where I'm much active on these social media platforms. Check me out as well at The Kevin Bass Show at YouTube and on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. And please leave a review and rating, especially leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Let me know how I'm doing. Let me know I'm doing a great job, because that would be much helpful to make sure that more people can find this podcast and be excited about it. If you have, if you have any ideas that you want to talk about for the podcast that you want me to talk about, let me know. That would be cool for me to do. If you have any comments, if you want to see this podcast succeed and thrive, share it on social media. Retweet it. If you find it in Twitter, if you find it on Instagram, share it as a story. If you find it on TikTok, I don't know how people share things on TikTok. At the minimum, like it, click subscribe. Also, click turn on your notifications, right? Turn on your notifications for this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on YouTube to make sure that you can receive the notifications and see when the latest episode comes out. That would be much appreciated. If you have nothing to say, no comments whatsoever, just write algo in YouTube, write algo, and it'll help the algorithm and it'll help promote the podcast. I hope you guys have really enjoyed watching this, listening to this. I know it's a little bit long. We're going through everything. We're going to go touch on every single aspect and just run through everything, because it's important that you guys know that it's important that people understand the real truth, not what necessarily what Huberman's telling people, which is not good. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. If you have, let me know. Send a donation. Follow me on social media. Give a shout out. Share it with your family. Share it with your grandma. Share it with your dog. Send me gifts of great luxury. Send me cash money. Don't send me drugs, because it can get me in trouble. And I don't do drugs. And send me statins, actually. Send me statins in the mail, please. Send me a rosuvastatin, a big, long prescription for rosuvastatin, a lifetime prescription for rosuvastatin. And I will make a plaque in your honor and post it on my banner for my Twitter and my YouTube. If you send me a lifetime prescription for rosuvastatin, it's all I ever wanted. Hope you guys like the podcast for real, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.